Hello. In these days of crisis and lockdown, which is bringing many considerable stress and sadness, it's important for us to keep our eyes on the one who is bigger than our biggest problems and concerns, and who can be trusted to guard us and guide us through the greatest crises that we face. As we have seen in the past, God is all-powerful, the Creator, the Lord, ruling over nature and over every other power and authority. And He's also our Father. He cares for each of us and loves us enough to give us His Son to die for us. And I want in these sermons to keep that focus on a great God who cares about us and is there for us in whatever situation we find ourselves. Today I want to think about a familiar story, and I'm going to read some verses from Genesis 39, verses 1 to 6. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all the things that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, as we know, the story goes on. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, but he will have none of it. She then lies about him to Potiphar, and Joseph ends up in prison. Here is some more of the story from verse 19. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. First then, just a reminder of the situation. Joseph was one of 12 brothers. Their father was Jacob, who was renamed Israel. Jacob had several wives. His favourite was Rachel, and because Joseph was Rachel's son, he was also Jacob's favourite. And Jacob did nothing to hide that. He gave Joseph his famous coat, which we all think of as a coat of many colours. Some translate it as a long-sleeved coat. The latest NIV just describes it as ornate. The truth is, the description is not clear, but whatever it looked like, that coat marked Joseph out as special. It showed him and his brothers that Jacob loved him more than them, and that was bound to cause trouble. And we see signs of it in Genesis 37:4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now Jacob should have known better. Favoritism ran in his family, and he had seen firsthand the problems it could cause. His brother Esau was his father's favourite, while he was his mother's favourite. And that had led to lies and to deception and to the breakdown of relationships. And in the end, he had to flee for his life. He should have known better, but even so, we find him acting in the same way that had caused such devastation in the past. And that's the way things often work in families. Rather than learning from past mistakes, we go on repeating them. And of course, Joseph played on that. And at the beginning of chapter 37, we see him telling tales to Jacob about his brothers. And then there were Joseph's dreams, which pointed to a time when his brothers and even his parents would one day bow down to him. Given the tension between Joseph and his brothers, you might have expected him to play that down. But not Joseph. He shared that information with his family. And not just once, he did it twice. And of course that made the problem worse. Joseph was spoilt. He revelled in his father's preferential treatment and took every opportunity, it seems, to rub it in with his brothers. And as the narrative unfolds, it's no real surprise to us that as well as hating him, his brothers were also looking for an opportunity to kill him. Now that opportunity came when they were a long way from home looking after their flocks, and Joseph was sent to find them and make sure that they were okay. And that highlights another problem in the family. Not only has Jacob stirred up bad feeling between Joseph and the others, but he seems totally oblivious to the problem. He has experienced the devastating effects of favoritism himself. He has seen what it can do and the trouble that it can cause, even to the extent of having to flee for his own life. But not only does he repeat the mistakes of his own parents, but he seems to have forgotten completely the problems it causes. And so here he sends Joseph out into the desert where he'll be alone with people who want him dead. And Joseph too seems to have no idea just how bad things are. He seems to have no inkling of the danger he might be in. The narrator here emphasizes just how much Joseph's brothers hated him. And yet Jacob and Joseph, the two people at the center of the problem, just don't see it. They seem to be so caught up in their own lives that they are oblivious to the effect that what they're doing and saying is having on others. And of course, there are lessons there for all of us. Now, as I've said, at this point in the story, Joseph appears as a spoilt child, totally naive to the problems around him and the effect of his words and actions on others. And the narrator, the person telling the story, doesn't do anything to make us like Joseph or feel any real sympathy for him. Anyway, Joseph goes. His brothers see him coming and they plan to kill him. Then they decide that they can get rid of him and make some money at the same time by selling him to some traders who are on their way to Egypt. They then persuade Jacob that a wild beast has killed Joseph and Joseph is taken as a slave to Egypt. And so we come to the story in Genesis 39. Now, as we look at this story, which has a bit of everything, sex, lies, intrigue, betrayal, there is something else that stands out, and that is the repeated theme. The Lord was with Joseph. It's there in verses 2, 3, 21 and 23. And that's what I want to focus on today. Through all that happened, the Lord was with Joseph. And I have 2 points. The first thing is we see God's presence. The Lord was with Joseph. Now, I wonder if Joseph realized that. At this stage in the story, I'm not sure that he did, though much later in his life, when he looked back at all of the things that had happened, he recognized that God had been there all the time. In Genesis 45, when he's talking to his brothers in Egypt, he says this to them: "Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for sending me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And it was not you who sent me here, but God." Now, Genesis 37 describes Jacob's change in status from a favourite son to a slave. And there is something surprising in my view in that chapter. In the whole of that chapter, there is no reference to God. Even when Joseph is describing his dreams, God is left out of the picture entirely. Yet when Joseph is looking back on these experiences later in his life, he sees God's presence in all of it. But in Genesis 37, in all of the conversations, there is no mention of God. And by telling the story in this way, the narrator is showing us that in all of the things that are going on in those verses, Joseph, Jacob, and the brothers have no real concern for God. Joseph is concerned about himself. So is Jacob, and so are Joseph's brothers. Their lives revolve around their own feelings, their own plans, their own ambitions. God does not figure in their actions. Now, this is one of the things I like about looking at narrative, at storytelling in the Bible. And of course, it's true of storytelling in all contexts. It's not just about what happened, but it's also about how the story is told, what is put in, what is left out, things that are repeated, things that are emphasized, and so on. Through all of that, the narrator is not only telling the story, but helping us to understand its significance. And the message running through the events of Genesis 37 seems to be that here we have a whole family making important decisions, but leaving God out of the picture. But then in chapter 39, everything is turned around. God is mentioned several times, and he is seen to be in control all the way through. Of course, the truth is God was in control from the start, but the main characters didn't get it. None of them was asking whether or not this was the right way to be thinking or feeling or behaving. And yet in all of it, as Joseph later realizes, God was still there. They might have left no room for God, but God was still in the story. God was still working out his purposes, as we'll go on to see. For Joseph, at least at the beginning, things were going pretty well. Favourite son, special gifts, dreams that seemed to set him apart from the others. And maybe in that situation he felt that he had no real need for God. But when things start to go wrong, when trouble comes, then the focus changes. And that can be our experience as well. When things are going well, we can ignore God, or at least give him a lesser place in our lives. When things are not going so well, that's when we turn to him. Well, Joseph was certainly in trouble when we discover that God was with him. In fact, he's in trouble twice in this story. First, when he is brought into Potiphar's household as a slave, his status has changed completely. No longer the spoilt child who gets everything he wants from a doting father. Now he is among the lowest in the household and has to do what he's told. But the Lord was with him. I'm sure he saw signs of that in the way his position changed. He may not have felt it at the beginning, but as things gradually got better, he would see God's hand in it all. As Potiphar entrusted more and more authority to him, Joseph might well have been able to see how God was at work in this situation. And when he was tempted to sleep with his master's wife, he resisted, partly because of his loyalty to Potiphar, but also because it was a sin against God. Significantly, that's the first time any of these characters in the story mention God, which tells us that Joseph is learning from his experience. So God raises him up, but only to allow him to come crashing down again. And significantly too, because the way the story is told, our opinion of Joseph is changing as well. We're shown a different side to him, and now we have much more sympathy with his plight. Now we know the story. Potiphar's wife lies about Joseph, accuses him of attempted rape, and Joseph is arrested and thrown into prison. Just when things were coming together, just when he was beginning to get his life sorted out, this happens, and he's back to square one. And at that point, it may not seem as though God is with him. But there in prison again, we are told, the Lord was with Joseph, as if to re-emphasize. He's gone through this early experience, things have gone well, God has been with him, then things have gone wrong. He's thrown into prison, and we're reminded again, very specifically, the Lord was with Joseph, even in this new situation. Now, I doubt that he could properly understand what was happening to him, where all this might be leading, why things had so quickly gone wrong when he had done what he believed to be right. Yet even in this period of real trouble, when he wasn't only in prison but might expect to be put to death at any time, God was there. Back at home, before any of this had happened, while he was spoilt by his father, while he was oblivious to the danger from his brothers, there wasn't the same sense of God's presence. God shows himself to Joseph in the struggle, in the hardship, at the point where Joseph needs him most. And most importantly, at the point where he realizes his need. Sold as a slave, thrown into prison, God was with him, and he could continue to know and experience God's presence. And that can be our experience too. The wonderful truth is that we too can know God's presence wherever we are. When things are going well, though maybe then we don't appreciate him as much, and also, and maybe even more powerfully, in the depths of defeat and despair. And in this present situation, he is with us. Now, closely linked to God's presence is the second point, and that is God's purpose. In everything that happened in Joseph's life, God was at work. Now, Joseph understood that later, but at the time, with the ups and downs that he went through, it was certainly not quite so obvious. God used the jealousy and hatred of Joseph's brothers. When he was being led on the long walk to Egypt as a slave, maybe Joseph felt some regret. Maybe he felt he could have handled things better, and of course he'd be right. But God could use even that. Of course, sin is serious and we need to repent of it, but God doesn't want us to be consumed by a sense of regret of what might have been. God can turn things around and can bring good out of evil. The prophet Joel makes a very poignant statement. I will repay you, God says through Joel, for the years the locusts have eaten. Locust swarms were and are devastating. In the past few months, swarms said to number billions of locusts have devastated parts of Africa. Each locust can eat its own body weight in a day, and when a swarm descends, it devours all of the crops in an area. It is devastating and, as I say, still a real threat. Now, Joel is writing in the aftermath of such a disaster. The ground is laid waste and there may seem little hope. But God can restore the years that the locust has eaten, the years in the wilderness, the years where we feel that there is no hope, the years that we think are wasted. God is able to give back what has been lost. God, who knows the end from the beginning, is at work in every situation. As we have seen, he brings order out of chaos. He brings light out of darkness. He brings life out of death. And God was there when that group of Ishmaelites just happened to go past at exactly the right time. A little earlier, and they would have missed Joseph. A little later, and Joseph might have already been dead. God was at work. Being bought by Potiphar was also part of God's plan. Joseph could probably see that as things began to get better for him. But then when he was accused by Potiphar's wife, the sense of regret may have kicked in again. If only I'd been sold to somebody else, then things would have been different. Things would have been better. And we might ask the same things or make the same comments. If only I'd gone to a different church or taken a different job or got into a different relationship or whatever, if only. But God was there in the midst of it all. Joseph was thrown into prison. That's not where he wanted to be. But, and this is a message to all of us when we may be tempted to question the wisdom of God's plans for us, it was the very place he needed to be for the next part of God's plan to be fulfilled. God's plans are not always worked out in the way we expect or hope. Joseph didn't want to be in prison, but that's where he needed to be. And then, of course, things started to look up for him again. The warden treated him with favour because God was with him. And then there were the two men who were brought in, Pharaoh's butler and Pharaoh's baker, who were also thrown into prison alongside Joseph. And he had the opportunity to interpret their dreams. Now, again, we're probably familiar with that story. It didn't turn out well for the baker. But the butler was restored to his former position. And Joseph then probably saw a way out. He could see how God was in this. He asked the butler to remember him. Again, things were looking up. God is at work. But what happened? The butler forgot about him. You know, you can imagine this in a current setting where we ask God for his help and something like this happens. And then we thank God for what he's done, and we tell others how we've had answers to prayer. And Joseph, may have confided in some of his fellow prisoners, this is what's happened. God is with me. God is going to get me out of this place. But what happens? The butler forgot about him. And Joseph remained in prison for the next 2 years, wondering why this was happening. We've got to be careful when we think we know what God's plan is, because it may not be exactly the plan that we think it is. The butler forgot, and Joseph remained in prison for the next 2 years, wondering why this was happening. Eventually, though, the butler did remember Joseph, and Joseph was brought out of prison at just the right time to make his most vital role in the life of his people. We think we know. Sometimes we think we know what God is planning. But God's ways are not our ways. His ways are far above our ways. But his ways are always best. The lesson here is that we can trust God. We can know his presence in every situation, and that's important. There are times in our lives when we just need to hang on. And the most important thing for us is to know that we can turn to him, that he is faithful, that he will never let us go. But we need to recognize too that even in the things that go wrong in our lives, and that includes the things that we bring on ourselves as well as the things that we have no control over, God is working his purposes out. We may not feel it at the time. Even when it's all over, we may not see just how God has used what we have been through. For Joseph, at least part of God's plan became clear, though this was much part of a much bigger story that he wasn't fully aware of. For someone like Job, he certainly didn't understand what was happening at the time, and it was never explained to him. The lesson Job had to learn was to trust God no matter what. And as the difficult circumstances of his life unfolded, that was what Joseph also learned. And it's a lesson for us as well. God has shown us how much he loves us. He's given his son to die for us. The death and resurrection of Jesus show us just how he can bring good out of what seemed like defeat and disaster. And that same love, that same faithfulness, that same transforming power is at work in our lives as well. God bless you. Amen.